Hey everyone, my name is Sarah Wasberg Johnson, also known as the Food Historian, and welcome to episode 10 of the Food History Happy Hour. Yeah, it's good to be here. It's been kind of hot. It's a little hot out on the porch today, but that's okay because we're gonna make a pretty awesome cocktail. Tonight we're gonna be making the bee's knees cocktail. Hey Marty, which is probably one of the more famous cocktails of those that I've done thus far, in that it actually has a little bit of a story behind it. So the bee's knees cocktail was created sometime in the 1920s, we think, by a bartender named, let me get his name right, yes, Frank Meier. Who was a bartender at the Paris Ritz, kind of a famous guy. He wrote a bartending guide that was published in 1936. I believe it was called The Art of Mixing Drinks. Let me just double check. The Artistry of Mixing Drinks. Yes. So included in that is the bee's knees, which I thought was a very appropriate spring cocktail. I'm also wearing yellow tonight in honor of bees and honey. We talked a little bit about pollinators and pollinator-friendly lawns last week, so I thought the bee's knees cocktail, that was weird, would be a good one. Hi Jonelle, welcome. So I think I'm going to go ahead and get started with the cocktail. It's pretty straightforward. Hi Carla. Just make sure I'm not missing anybody else. So to make the bee's knees, you need a cocktail shaker and some ice. Thankfully, I have plenty of ice this week, which is good because it's hot. So I'm going to put kind of a lot of ice in because I want my drink to be nice and cold. Marty says it's like citizen murder hornet knees. No, it's not murder hornet knees. I don't know why my light is doing that. Hold on. I have a new light. I don't know if I'm going to make it tell. I'm going to see if I can fix it though. It's like blinking weird. There we go. It has a dimmer switch, so. Hi, Rosemary. Who else am I missing? Hi, Eleanor. All right, so tonight we're making the bee's knees cocktail. We've started with our ice. It calls for a teaspoon of honey. I have some very nice local raw wildflower honey that I'm going to use. It's a little hard to measure a teaspoon of honey, but we're going to try. Of course, I probably should have oiled the spoon or something because now it's like going to be stuck on the spoon. Whatever, I'm going to stick the spoon in there for a little bit. And then Frank Meier's original recipe calls for a quarter of a lemon, which I don't have because it's quarantine and I never use up citrus fruit before it goes bad. So I have some nice bottled lemon juice. And generally they say half a lemon is a tablespoon. So a quarter of a lemon is probably half a tablespoon, but my teaspoon is already dirty, so I'm just gonna guesstimate here. I'm gonna say it's two teaspoons. Seems close to half a tablespoon, right? I should probably actually look that up. And then also I'm gonna do one of those so I don't have a sticky mess. And then it calls for gin. So I have my favorite Blue Coat American gin, and it calls for 1 ounce of that. So this is 1.5 ounces, but I'm going to guesstimate that that's 1 ounce. It's really not a very big cocktail. We'll see how it looks in the glass. Oh. Put my lemon juice back together. Make sure this is on tightly because last time it leaked. All right. I also want it like icy cold. Oh, that feels nice. And I want to make sure the honey gets all the way to the door. Okay, too cold to handle. That means it's done. All right, let's see how much this actually makes here. Not a lot. It's a very small cocktail, but that's okay. Looks like I'll drip out there. Okay. So there we have it. The bee's knees. If I was a fancy bartender, I probably would put like a curl of lemon peel on it or something, but there it is. It looks very refreshing. You can't really taste the honey at all, so I don't know, maybe he used a much bigger teaspoon than I did. That's not bad. It's very refreshing. All right, so what's everybody up to tonight? Some crazy stuff going on in the world. I thought we would talk about midnight suppers, but given current events, I thought perhaps we would also talk about historic food-related protests and riots, because there were a lot of those going on too. So one of the things I talk about in my book and in an article I published in New York History Journal is about the food riots of the Lower East Side in the fall and winter of 1916-1917. So I think I've talked about it before on this show that in the events leading up to World War I, there was something that economists call stagflation, which is when wages were stagnant but inflation was rising, and it gives you something called the high cost of living, or the HCL, which is something that they talk about a lot. Progressive reformers, home economists, socialists, pretty much anybody who was doing anything with economics and households was interested in the HCL, the high cost of living. And it resulted in a lot of people who formerly could afford on their working class salary to buy things like meat and butter and milk. They suddenly could no longer afford those things. And over the winter, in the fall of 1916, milk prices in New York City skyrocketed, and then throughout the winter, the price of pretty much everything else skyrocketed, including, the cheapest vegetables, potatoes, cabbage, onions, things like that. Some of them rose as much as 200% increase in just a couple of months, in a couple of weeks in some cases. And so, like other women around the world, because a lot of these protests were sort of happening simultaneously, Jewish working class women on the Lower East Side of New York, largely aided by socialist organizers, started a boycott of vegetables and a number of other foods that they thought were out of their price range, and they enforced that boycott with violence. They tipped over push carts, they broke windows on storefronts, they beat people up for violating, as they saw, the boycott. And eventually it culminates in a march of hungry women and children on the mayor's mansion in New York City, and kind of devolves into a series of riots in March of 1917. February and March, I should say. Also happening in February of 1917 were bread riots in Russia, which eventually became the February Revolution that overthrew the Russian monarchy and then, resulted in kind of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And there were other food-related riots and protests and boycotts going on all around the world, around the country, in Philadelphia and Boston and Chicago, and in places like Britain and Australia, um, places where, you know, there wasn't necessarily active war, but everybody was feeling the pinch of wartime demand for food and the rise in food prices and things like that. So yeah, historically, riots have been around, and sometimes they've fomented some change. The high cost of living, protests, and riots. Hi, Amanda. Well, I don't know that I'm a genius, but as a historian, I often see parallels between what's going on today and what has happened historically. So, these riots didn't necessarily result in any real price decreases, in part because we joined the war just a few months later. And I don't know if production went up or the reason why, but prices did eventually fall. There were some efforts by progressives, and this happened throughout the war, that they started publishing fair price schedules in newspapers, so that to avoid price gouging and black markets and stuff like that, they would publish what the government considered a fair price for household staples like groceries and stuff like that. Hi, Kitty. And that was one of the ways that they sort of put pressure on businesses to comply, so that if you went to a store where the prices were higher than the advertised, you know, approved prices, you as a consumer could ask why that was, or potentially report people. So that was one of the ways that the protests were successful. And it was really difficult, I think, for middle and upper middle class people to do very much about these riots and boycotts and protests, in large part because they were led by women, and women with hungry children. So it's kind of hard, especially in an era where we're coming off of the Victorian era, where we have, you know, the mother is the angel in the house, right? She's the ideal of Republican motherhood, and it's her job to care for and raise her children. And if she can't afford bread and milk and food for her family, you know, it wasn't really considered her fault, even women who were working. So there's accounts of policemen having a hard time, like, figuring out what to do with these women, because it wasn't really considered, you know, they might be lower working class women, but they're still women, and so it was not politic to arrest them or beat them up or any of these other things. Suffragists, on the other hand, were a slightly different story, in part because they largely were not protesting on behalf of their hungry children, and they did. Amanda, thank you. Oh, Amanda says, side note, you're the only white person I have seen look good in yellow. I wasn't sure about this top. It's the first time I'm wearing it, but, you know, I thought I would go with it because we need a cheerful color, and I wanted to honor the bees, so that's why I'm wearing yellow today. But yeah, suffragists were not treated with the same sort of tentative respect as mothers protesting on behalf of their children. They were jailed. Those who went on hunger strikes were force-fed. They were not treated well. They weren't necessarily beat up, but they were not treated kindly either. So, you know, when I see a lot of stuff in the news about, or on Facebook, of people saying, well, why didn't they just protest peacefully or comply with the law? There's been a lot of instances in our history and in global history when there's a time when peaceful protest doesn't work, and so desperate people resort to violence. And it's happened with unions. I mean, Amanda, who's watching right now, is, I think, a big fan, as I am, of union history. Lots of union busting, including shootouts and other violent encounters. But for the most part, if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't have a lot of the worker protections that we have today. So, Yeah, Kitty. Oh, you gotta look up. Kitty says, "Yikes, force fed." It's really horrific, and I haven't seen it, but there was a film that came out a couple of years ago about the women's suffrage movement and some of the sort of horrific treatment that they received in jails. I mean, jails and prisons in the 19 teens were not nice places anyway. Certainly not for women, largely white, middle, and upper class women. That was like a real shock to them and to the nation to have to see people who are supposed to be treated with great respect endure that sort of torture, because a lot of it was. One woman in particular died because they put the feeding tube into her lungs instead of into her stomach. They broke women's jaws. I mean, some pretty awful stuff. So don't misuse your right to vote. That's all I'm going to say about that. All right, so I just wanted to get that off my chest because I know it's been in the news a lot, and I know a lot of people are talking about it. And some of the topics that we were going to talk about tonight were kind of frivolous, so I thought maybe we should start out with some more serious history and how current events are reflected in the past. So if anybody has any questions about that, they can go ahead and ask. I will also say I've been doing book update. A couple of my writing friends made the very important point, or the very striking point to me, I thought, that it's important to touch the book every day. So do one little thing that is contributing to the book. And I haven't quite gotten there yet because I've been putting in some extra work hours at the end of this week. But I really love that idea. And so one of the things I did the other night was I started transcribing some more of my farmerette resources. There is an excellent book. I'm forgetting the name of the author right now. I'll post it in the blog. But there has been an excellent book written about the Women's Land Army, which was started in New York. The farmerette movement in many ways started in New York State. But that book is about the official organization, and I'm finding out that there were lots of other sort of unofficial versions of farmerettes and women farmer training in New York that were kind of happening simultaneously. But it is very closely related to the women's suffrage movement, which I thought was very interesting. So we've talked about farmerettes before. I can explain a little more if anybody's interested. Otherwise, I'm going to take a sip of my drink, and then I think we're going to talk about midnight suppers. Yeah, it definitely needs more honey, you guys. I'm wondering when you said teaspoon if you actually meant like an actual spoon and not a measure. Probably, it's hard to tell. Okay. It's also really hot in here. I think I might open a window. It was raining earlier. Why does it always rain on Fridays when I do this? I don't know. Oh yeah. That's better. Nice and cool outside. All right. So the topic that I planned to talk to you about tonight is something called midnight suppers. And I didn't bring any of my cookbooks down, which was a mistake, but that's okay. I'll post it in the blog. So in the 19-teens and 20s, among middle and upper middle class people, there started to be more and more of a movement in cities to spend time on late night entertainments. So you start to get this thing called the midnight supper, which is basically after the theater, or, you know, going to a concert or a club or any other sort of late night entertainment, although mostly the theater, you would come back to the house and have a midnight supper. It's just the coolest little thing that I think doesn't really happen anymore because, I don't know, people aren't that interesting, I guess. You don't have people over to your house after midnight. Definitely you did start to get supper clubs and things staying open later and later, depending on what the entertainments were in the area. But people also did host midnight suppers in their homes. They became very popular in the 1920s. I think in part probably a reaction to Prohibition. You know, in the flapper culture, people were going out later at night. They were going to a speakeasy where the booze isn't that good and the food is probably worse. So people would come back home and put on these midnight suppers. They were generally very easy and quick to make because, of course, you have to make it while your guests are there. They often use chafing dishes, which I think we've talked about on here before. It's basically, if you've ever gone to a catered event and seen like a hotel pan in the little thing with the feet over the open flame, that's essentially what a chafing dish is, although in the 1920s, electric powered chafing dishes started to get more popular. But basically it's like, open up a can of shrimp and make a white sauce and have creamed shrimp on toast, or lobster Newburg, or Welsh rarebit, things that you could make tableside in the chafing dish that didn't take a lot of time, but were still kind of like this yummy late night thing that you could eat before you go to bed, maybe to soak up all the alcohol you drink. I'm not sure. But I have a couple of versions of a Frigidaire cookbook, believe it or not, that has all these beautiful 1920s illustrations, and it has a whole section on midnight suppers and basically how you can use your refrigerator to sort of have everything prepped and ready for chafing dish cookery for the midnight suppers. So I thought that was just a cool little thing that we don't really do anymore. It has kind of a short-lived life, by the 1930s probably. People aren't really doing midnight suppers anymore, but it has sort of this era of mystique. So Kitty says a while ago, Denny's took over the midnight suppers. Yeah, definitely, I think, related to the people who were attending jazz clubs and theaters and other late night entertainments, the performers also needed to eat after midnight, and that's how you start to get late night food trucks. Basically, you start to get 24-hour diners. It's supposedly how chicken and waffles were invented, right, as late night after performance food. That was both dinner and breakfast, right? So kind of our 24-hour late night diner culture starts because the rich people who attended these things were going home and making their own midnight suppers, but all the performers also needed to eat. So they went out to these diners, to these late night food carts, things like that, so that they could also get a bite to eat. So yeah, now we have late night restaurants, bars are open super late, but it's kind of this little vignette when you had a lot of live performances, live theater, live music everywhere, lots of people attending these things, and so people would need something to eat. Kitty asked, are these events something that would commonly continue into the morning hours? It's hard to tell. Definitely, I think the midnight suppers, it was, a kind of a way to continue socializing after the event. But I don't think people were necessarily staying out that late, although it's hard to tell. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they think about the past, they think that, people got up early and went to bed early. And that's true for farmers and some working class people, but all the way back into the 18th century, if you were wealthy, you were going to parties that might last until 5 or 6 in the morning. And then you wouldn't get up until noon or 1 o'clock if you were rich. So kind of this interesting thing, if you're at all into Regency novels, like I am, you see all sorts of references to people being surprised that the genteel lady would be up before noon, like that kind of thing. And I think that is something that kind of continues among the upper crust into the 20th century, in part because they're out so late at night partying. I ran across a couple of things that talked about, no longer is it dinner at 6 and a show at 8. Now it's, you go to the shows and then you have dinner afterwards, which I thought was interesting. You might go to a 10 o'clock show and then have your midnight supper afterwards. So I think definitely there probably were people who were staying out super late, but the midnight supper is something I think that starts at midnight. So probably by 2 a.m. everybody was heading for home. So anyway, I just thought that those were fun. Anybody have any questions for me? I definitely need more honey, you guys. There's some honey left on this spoon. I'm gonna see if I can get it. Get it in my drink. No other questions? I mean, the other thing that we're going to talk about tonight is a little depressing. I could talk a little bit more about Frank Meier, the inventor of the bee's knees. I found an article, which again, I'll post the whole thing in the blog, that talked about his role and the role of the Ritz in Paris during the occupation of Paris in World War II. And that apparently he was involved in the Paris resistance, and in fact most of the staff at the Ritz were involved in one way or another with the resistance. And apparently there was like illegal betting that went on at the Ritz, and then that was like cover for their resistance agents. So they would come in like they were placing a bet, but they were really exchanging information. The interesting thing about Frank Meier is that apparently he kind of disappears because they find out that he had been bilking people out of money, basically. That he was not only stealing potentially from the Ritz, but also like people who needed to get their assets out of occupied France. He would like help them, but then they would never actually get their money back. So he sort of flees in disgrace, and it's not really known what happens to him after that. So, kind of a character. But, anyway. Alright, well, if there's no questions, I guess we can talk about poison candy, because that was also on my list to talk to you tonight. We're kind of jumping all over the place, but that's okay. So I don't know if anybody watched The Poison Squad on PBS or read the book by Deborah Bloom. I do recommend watching it. It's very interesting. It's about Harvey Wiley and the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. In my Cooking by the Book talk, I talk about an 1830s treatise called, I forget what it's called. It's by a German guy named Frederick Acum, and he published it in London in the 1830s. And it's basically all about adulterated foods. So foods that are contaminated, usually on purpose, with non-food items. And so the interesting thing about Frederick Acum is he does all these chemical experiments to showcase adulterated foods, but he never calls for any sort of regulation. Instead, he kind of leaves it on the housewife to be educated enough to figure out what is safe for her family to eat and what's not. So, we don't actually get food regulation legislation until 1906 with the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Amanda has a good question about riot food. I will come back to that when I'm done talking about poison candy here. So, leading up to the Pure Food and Drug Act, you could put anything you wanted in food and pass it off as real food, right? The Pure Food and Drug Act regulates not only what is considered food, but also regulates food advertising and drug advertising, so it kind of signals the end of patent medicine. But it also brings a lot of attention to what foods were safe to eat, and that is something that Harvey Wiley is very involved in. A lot of the people involved in the passage of the Food and Drug Act of 1906 were middle and upper class women who were very concerned since the 1860s with the purity and health of milk. In the 1860s, there was a tuberculosis scare and a swill milk scare. So swill milk is from urban dairies where cows are confined and fed on spent grain from breweries. So of course we're also tying into the temperance movement here. But so the cows were super unhealthy. Some of them had to be, lifted up with straps under them, like craned up so that they could be milked because they couldn't stand. They were filthy conditions. They were largely operated by men, transient men who weren't very clean, and there was a series of tuberculosis outbreaks in the milk that killed some children. So that really starts galvanizing people to push for food regulation. It ends with the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So Eleanor's also, you guys are talking about the riots already. So one of the things that gets regulated under the Pure Food and Drug Act is candy. So candy was often colored, brightly colored, right? And the way that they got colors was from a whole host of chemicals, most of which were really poisonous and not good for children. So I actually have a cookbook in my collection that is about homemade candy, and part of it talks about without artificial colors or sweeteners or whatever else is in it that might be unwittingly poisoning your child. So it's a whole cookbook on how to make candy at home from scratch, that you know what's in it and you know that it's safe for your child to eat. So, sound familiar? that kind of thing still happens today. But yeah, that's just my little aside on poison candy. And now we can talk about riot food, because that's what Amanda and Eleanor are interested in. So Amanda asked, do you have any info about riot food? What did they eat and how did they organize it? And Eleanor says not riot food, but there was at least one kitchen in which parts of the civil rights movement were planned. Yes, so the civil rights movement, food definitely played a huge role in the civil rights movement, which you don't really think about. And I'm totally forgetting her name. Someone can look it up for me and post it in the comments. But there was one woman in particular who ran a kitchen that not only fed the organizers of the civil rights movement, but also fundraised for the civil rights movement. I've posted about her before on Facebook. I'm totally blanking on her name. I should probably just look her up, because otherwise that's going to bother me. That's who Eleanor is talking about. And she's not the only one. There definitely were other women who did similar things. Yes, Georgette Gilmore is the best known woman of the civil rights movement. Yes, so a lot of black women in particular in the 20th century ran like little restaurants out of their houses, out of their homes. People still do that in some parts of the South. You can buy food, buy a plate, kind of a thing going on. But yes, that was definitely George Gilmore, and women like her were instrumental in funding and helping organize the civil rights movement. So during World War I, and the events leading up to it, it's a little harder to figure out how they fed people during riots. The riots, although they did have some organizers, especially in socialist circles, they tended to be a little bit more amorphous in terms of, yes, Eleanor, you're welcome, in terms of the organization. So they weren't necessarily planned on the same level as a lot of the civil rights protests and marches and boycotts and things like that. They were a little more, kind of spur of the moment, if you will. I'm pretty sure there's some socialist cookbooks floating around out there. I'll have to see if I can track some down and see if they make any reference to food and organizing. Definitely there were some fundraising cookbooks, particularly for the women's suffrage movement, to help fund the activities that they were doing. But as to what food people actually ate, it's hard to tell. I mean, in New York City, particularly on the Lower East Side, there are food carts everywhere, push carts. Although a lot of the food boycotts, the push cart owners sort of get caught in the middle of them. Eleanor is also talking about Koinonia? Am I pronouncing that right? Christian commune in Plains, Georgia. A way station for civil rights workers. Yeah. So for instance, for the food riots in 1917 and the food boycotts, I don't know that they were eating much of anything. because food prices were so very high. There were reports from progressive reformers of people subsisting on like a slice of bread and tea once a day, or eating just like rice and tea or coffee, you know. So people were really, really hungry, and that's part of the reason why the boycotts and the riots happen, is because people are just so desperate that they'll, you know, they don't know what else to do. So I don't know that there was a whole lot of food organization going on behind the scenes for those. But for other planned riots and boycotts, yes, definitely the civil rights movement, food plays a big role. I think I've talked before also, this is slightly related. I think I talked last time about Great Depression food and rent parties. So people would make a lot of cheap food and invite their friends over, and you would, you know, chip in for the food, and then that's how people would raise money to pay their rent. That was a thing that definitely happened. That's slightly related. So yeah, I'll have to look. I mean, the 19 teens were kind of an era of fundraising cookbooks. There was a number of cookbooks sold to fundraise for Allied relief and Belgian relief, to raise money to send to the Allies, and in particular to occupied Belgium, which was completely overrun by the Germans, and, you know, babies and women and old people starving in the streets, kind of a thing. So you do get some really interesting European recipes in some of these fundraising cookbooks. But yeah, I'll have to look into. Maybe, Amanda, maybe next time we'll talk about Union food, if there's any food-related history with Union strikes and things like that. So yeah, good question. Sorry, I don't really know much of an answer to it, but I can definitely post links to the stuff about food and the civil rights in the blog when I post this whole video. All right, does anybody else have any other questions? That's pretty much all I had planned for the evening. Okay, yes, it's slightly better with a little more honey in it. Otherwise, I don't know what else we could talk about. I might be doing a talk next month on Victory Gardens for a local library. So when that is scheduled, I'll go ahead and post that. And I am also doing a talk on Tuesday that's not open to the public, but I think they're going to record it, about food in World War I in the Hudson Valley. So once I get my hands on that recording, I will post it maybe on YouTube, because I'm now verified on YouTube. So, you know, in my spare time I can post videos of any length instead of just 15 minutes. I don't know what else to talk about, you guys. I'm at a loss. It's been a week. A lot of my historian friends are sort of wondering how historians are going to discuss 2020. Oh, Eleanor says, how about your Laura Ingalls Wilder post? Yes, we can talk about Laura Ingalls Wilder if you want. I actually started reading last night the Little House Cookbook, which I bought a while ago because I grew up with a copy of that. My mom is a big Laura Ingalls Wilder fan and has most everything that's been published about her. In fact, I think it was for my mom for Christmas. Oh my gosh, I can't remember. I think it's my mom got me the Pioneer Girl annotated biography, I think, of Laura Ingalls Wilder, which I haven't read yet. It's huge. But I started reading the cookbook last night, and it was published in the 1970s, I'm pretty sure, originally, which makes sense coming out of the bicentennial. But it is surprisingly well researched for a bicentennial era. You know, 1970s, early 80s era historical cookbook. Very well researched. Not very big. I highly recommend it. It's organized by type of food. So for instance, like all the game meats are in one chapter, things like that. All the staple foods are in another chapter. And the reason why I loved it so much as a kid is it has passages from the books talking about food, and then it has the recipe that matches the food discussed in that passage. So it's like it's comfort food for me. I read it a lot when I was growing up. One of my favorite Laura Ingalls Wilder books. I mean, love them all except for the first 4 years. I hated that book. I love them all, but Farmer Boy and Little Town on the Prairie were my favorites. Farmer Boy because it's full of food descriptions. And Little Town on the Prairie because that was like the romance between Laura and Almanzo, right? Eleanor says, anyone up for a post-lockdown trip to DeSmet, South Dakota? I have actually been to the Laura Ingalls Wilder home in South Dakota. We went when I was a kid. I think I might have been like 10 or 12. It's much smaller and more Victorian than you would think. But, you know, that's not surprising about them. I also reread the books not too long ago, and, you know, there's been some controversy about Laura Ingalls Wilder recently because parts of it are fairly racist, right? But it is a product of the time. You know, Mom makes some disparaging remarks about Native people. Pa and some people are involved in a minstrel show where they're wearing blackface. So, you know, not the greatest, but I think you kind of have to take books in the context of the time period they were written. Kind of like we do with our founding fathers and a whole host of other racist people and events in our past. So we definitely need to acknowledge it, but we also have to think about it in the time that it's portrayed. One interesting thing that people don't talk about a lot is, I think it's in Little House on the Prairie. They go and they build a new house, and then Pa finds out that they have built their house on native land in Indian country, in Indian territory. And he thinks that's wrong. He's not supposed to be there, so they leave. Which I thought was a good lesson. So, interesting series of books. Not a huge Rose Wilder fan. If you read up more about her, there's some speculation that she helped ghostwrite a lot of her mother's books. And there's some interesting analysis because Rose Wilder was basically a libertarian. And a lot of how the books are written is to sort of glorify rugged individualism and pioneer spirit and things like that. But reading the books as an adult, you realize not only how close to the very kind of bleeding edge of subsistence they're living a lot of times, and you get very mad at Pa for dragging everybody pillar to post instead of settling down in one spot. But also how dependent they are on the outside world, you know. Yeah, they're hunting and raising their own food and stuff like that, but they never stay in one place long enough to really get an established farm. So they're purchasing most of their staple foods. Like, for instance, the Laura Ingalls Wilder cookbook talks about how it was the Ingalls' dream to have bread from their own wheat, which they never achieve, or don't until very late in life. And they're very dependent on railroads and the general store, as we see in the long winter. When railroads are shut down, people practically starve, including the Ingalls family. In part because they do live quite close to the edge of subsistence and poverty, but also because they're not really that self-sufficient. So, Eleanor says, I believe Rose Wilder was one of the first correspondents in Vietnam during the war and one of the few women. Yeah, so, I mean, she seems like a very interesting person, but I'm not a huge fan of her politics. Let's just put it that way. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting to look back on the our childhood favorites and see how an adult perspective can change them. I have a very similar experience with Ellen Montgomery books. Ellen Montgomery is another one of my favorite authors from that kind of same time period. She was writing in the 1900s and 19-teens in Canada. She's most famous for Anne of Green Gables, although that is not my favorite book. My favorite book of hers is Blue Castle, which is actually more of an adult romance, which I really enjoy. And also Jane of Lantern Hill, which is another book that's full of food. Because Jane really wants to learn how to cook, but her grandmother is a very wealthy socialite and think that that's just for servants, and so kind of stifles her. And it's not until she leaves her grandmother's house, I won't spoil it, but that she learns to cook and gets a lot of joy out of teaching herself how to cook. So I enjoy that book too. But again, also Ellen Montgomery, not without her racism and classism, definitely typical of the time. No black people in those books, but a lot of racism toward French Canadians in the Canadian Maritimes, Ellen Montgomery being quite English, and a lot of classism as well. So Canadian, Eastern Canadian version of racism, I guess. So yeah, those are some of my favorite books when I was growing up, and of course all the American Girl books. And I had a couple of the American Girl cookbooks, which was super fun. So yes, historical fiction played a big role in my interest in food history and history in general. So let your kids read historical fiction. Unless you don't want them to grow up to be historians, in which case don't let them read it, I guess. I don't know. Alright, that was a good tangent. Eleanor, anybody else have any questions for tonight? What's everybody up to? I don't have a lot planned for the weekend. I think I'm going to stay home and do some laundry, clean the house because I haven't cleaned it for a while. Maybe get some blog posts done because I'm super behind on a lot of blog posts. Maybe get some writing done on the book, some research on the book. Pet my book, as my friend Carla said. Don't just touch it, pet it. So that's my plan. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to talk about. Keep touching my phone. Not really. Plant native plants to help bees. Oh, did you know that honeybees are not native to North America? I forgot I was going to talk about that. Yes, they are imported from Europe. So, North America has thousands of native bees, but none of them produce honey, which is interesting. Oh, Marty requests that I do a little chat about easy bake ovens. I don't think I had an easy bake oven when I was growing up. Or if I did, we didn't use it. I don't remember. I seem to remember encountering one as a child, but we didn't actually like plug it in and cook anything in it. But yeah, easy bake ovens would be a fun topic. Another thing that's potentially coming down the pike for me is and maybe assisting with a little show about 1970s recipe cards and some of the crazy recipes that were on them, like Weight Watchers and McCall's and stuff like that. So haven't actually done any recording for that, but that's something that has been requested of me by the media. So we'll see where that goes. But remember when I said I was researching hot dogs? That's what it was for. So we'll see how that comes out. But yes, we can definitely talk about easy bake ovens for next week, Marty. I will put it on my list. Speaking of, I think I made a list of stuff to talk about. Let me just see if I'm missing anything on my list. I don't know why I didn't think of that earlier. Oh, and I forgot to look up if hay boxes were used in Sabbath cooking. Alright, I'll revisit that last week. Ooh. Alright, Cammie. Hi, Cammie. Yes, we can totally add Jell-O to our easy bake oven conversation. In part, because one of the things I've been meaning to research for a while is why, like, every brand of gelatin starts in New York State. Jell-O starts in Leroy, New York. Knox Gelatin also starts in New York. I forget exactly where. Someone can look it up. And Junket is started by Christian Hansen Laboratories in Little Falls, New York, which I only know because my husband's family is from Little Falls. And my mother, when looking at a box of Danish dessert, which is like a fruit pudding, one time in the grocery store, was looking at the back and noticed that it said Christian Hansen Laboratories, Little Falls, New York, and was like, isn't this where your husband's family is from? And I was like, yes. So that's three gelatin related companies that all started in New York. Why? I don't know. I'll try and figure out for next week. And yes, we can talk about aspic. I have talked about aspic and gelatin with many journalists and food writers over the last couple of years, so I have some strong opinions about it. So we can definitely talk about aspic next week. Oh, hold on. Sorry, somebody was talking to me. Alright, so I'm going to write this down. Easy bake ovens, Jello/aspic. And I will try to look up hay boxes and Sabbath. Yes, and we can just talk about vintage food in general. Wow, my phone just corrected aspic to ask if. That's not what that means, phone. Oh, Cammy says, I heard something about the patent for Jello being passed around because nobody liked it for a long time. It wasn't always fruit flavored. Interesting recipes from the 1960s, though. Yeah, so gelatin actually has a really long history. If you've ever heard of calf's foot jelly, like in old cookbooks or historical novels or anything like that, that's an early form of gelatin. And one of the things that I've talked about with journalists before is that a lot of the convenience foods that come out first in the turn of the century, gelatin, canned consomme, creamed soups, things like that, crackers, were all things that were all foods that were previously sort of relegated to the upper class because they were very labor intensive. It's very labor intensive to make gelatin from cow bones and calf's feet. It's smelly. You have to clarify the gelatin to get the taste, the yucky taste out of it. Like, it's not an easy thing to do. You have to put it in fancy molds. You know, you have to have the money to buy all these fancy molds. Same thing with consomme. You know, you have to have a lot of meat and meat bones. You have to cook it for a long time. You have to clarify it because it's supposed to be this clear broth. Because it's a clear broth, it doesn't have a ton of food value. You know, so it's a lot of labor for not a lot of results. And same thing with cream soups. Any kind of pureed soup had to be rubbed through a hair sieve. That's how you got the things creamed. So the fact that these were previously upper class food, same with biscuits. If you ever, I don't know if you guys know the story of beaten biscuits, which is like a southern specialty. And it's a southern specialty because it's so incredibly labor intensive that basically you have to have enslaved people to make them. Beaten biscuits are basically you are folding biscuits and beating them, originally with a wooden mallet, although later they did create like kind of a cranked thing that you would put the dough through. And you're basically laminating the cracker dough and putting all of these little air bubbles in it so that when you bake it, it puffs up really, really light. But it's a food that traditionally used enslaved people to make it because it's extraordinarily labor intensive. It takes a ton of physical strength in order to do it. And of course, the people who were eating them didn't have to make it themselves, right? You force someone to do it instead. But then you start to get manufactured crackers, right? And they have very similar, have you ever had a Ritz? It's not quite the same as a beaten biscuit, but it's very similar, laminated, light, crunchy technique. So a lot of that 19th century foods that were very labor intensive, in the 20th century they figured out how to mechanize and commercialize so that they're more accessible to everybody without all the incredible human labor behind them. So that's my little aside. But yeah, Jello, I mean, I think plain, until you have commercially available gelatin, it really is you know, nobody's cooking too much with it. But then it gets so easy, especially when they add fruit flavors and sugar already to the mix, right? So that's why it becomes popular. And also because we have refrigeration, which makes making Jell-O a lot easier as well. So yeah, we'll talk more about Jell-O next week. I'll do a little research into the gelatin companies, see if I can figure out why they all started in New York and all kind of around the same time. And we'll talk about aspic, which is another very, very old dish. And we'll talk about easy bake ovens. Are there any other requests for next week, or any last questions for the evening? Marty says I should make Jell-O shots. I don't think I'm gonna make Jell-O shots, Marty, but I will add them to the list to look up, like, when did Jell-O shots start and why did that become a thing? Because I think that would be interesting. I think they sound gross, personally. I've never had a Jell-O shot. I don't really want to have a Jell-O shot. Like oysters, I don't want to just have slimy, jiggly thing in my mouth. That doesn't sound appealing to me. We'll see. We'll see what I can find. I don't know what I'll do for a cocktail next week, but maybe I'll do a non-alcoholic beverage with gelatin in it. I'm sure I can find a thing. Or maybe I'll do something with ice cream next week. We'll see. It's getting so hot out, you guys. All right. Any last minute questions or requests? Thank you for giving me so many ideas for next week. This will be fun. Hopefully I'll have time to research them all. That's why I have to make notes for myself. Also, can you guys believe I've been doing this for 10 weeks now? We're in episode 10. It's kind of crazy to think about, but here we are. I might also, I'm thinking about uploading these to YouTube. What do you guys think? Would that make them more accessible? Are they interesting enough to upload to YouTube? I don't know. I've just been doing the cocktails, but we'll see. Let me know in the comments. All right. I think I'm going to cut this one a couple minutes short tonight, you guys. Because it's really hot out here without air conditioning, even with the window open. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight, and for asking super great questions, and for giving me such a nice list of topics to discuss for next week. I will see you all next Friday at 8 o'clock right here on Facebook. This has been the Food History Happy Hour. I'm Sarah Westford Johnson, and thanks for watching. Good night.